We have exciting news. You can now afford to have your own freeze dryer. That's right, for the first time ever, it's possible to have a freeze dryer in your home. It was invented right here in America by harvestright. With this new appliance, you can freeze dry your own food and it will last 25 years. Imagine freeze drying fruit, vegetables, meat, and your own homemade meals. It's as easy to use as a microwave. Learn more about this amazing home freeze dryer at harvestright.com. Again, that's harvestright.com.
I have Stephanie Barlow with Harvestright on the line with me. Steph, you there?
Good morning.
Good morning, Steph. I finally got you for an interview. So you're from Harvestright, and you guys make these in-home freeze dryers. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, so Harvestright invented the world's first in-home freeze dryer. Before Harvestright, then obviously freeze dryers existed, but they were much more complicated. They were meant for people who had to have a lot more information about how to work them. So, and they cost a lot more money. And usually there were people that were running them at commercial facilities. And you had to have knowledge like how much water is in the food, how long does it need to go for. You could only do certain things at a certain time. And what Harvestright did is try and figure out how to make that same technology, but make it available to use in the home and make it smart so that it would know when your food actually was done. So you didn't have to have a lot of knowledge about how much water content was in something. You could just put your food in, you could start it, and you could come back when it was all done, and the actual unit would let you know when it was ready to be done. So that's one of the best things that's been able to happen with this technology is that now people are able to freeze dry food in their own freeze dryer, the food that they like, and not have to worry that it's not something they wouldn't want to eat, but that it can be exactly what they wanted, and that it's very simple and easy to do.
Cool. So it's a lot less complicated and it's cheaper.
Yes, a lot cheaper. So the original commercial versions that could do about the same amount of food that this in-home Harvestright freeze dryer does, those typically cost around $30,000. So ours is a lot cheaper than that, but still an investment. But what we tell people all the time when they ask, because it is about 1/10 the price of what the original version used to be, and that's still a lot of money for a lot of people. But we tell them that if you were looking to freeze dry or buy freeze dried food to produce about the same amount of freeze dried food, if you were to buy that same amount, you would spend about $10,000. So essentially, the freeze dryer can produce about $10,000 worth of freeze dried food in a year, which usually means for most people that they can see that the investment will be worth it over a year's worth of time.
Absolutely. I mean, the food price alone lately is incredible. I went shopping yesterday, and we spent $200 for the week, and it feels like we didn't even buy anything. Like we bought a bunch of salad dressings and some pasta, and that was it. Like it was I can't believe how expensive food is lately.
Yeah, that's so true. And one of the things that we also tell people is that when you're used to buying your own food too, you always have leftovers and food that goes bad because you just can't eat it fast enough, or you make more than you needed, and you just don't feel like eating it for the next 3 or 4 days. So you eat it for like one day, but then after that you're like, I'm tired of that. So people also waste a lot of food.
Oh yeah, sure. I throw out a ton of food.
Yeah, and you could have just freeze dried that leftover food too. So if you made a big pot of chili, but you didn't feel like eating chili every night of the week for 5 nights, then you could freeze dry it, and that could become part of, an essential part of your long-term or even short-term food storage. And then you could pull it out and eat it again when you had, an emergency, or even if you were just like, okay, now I'm ready to eat chili again because it's been a couple months.
Yeah. Me and my wife, we started our own survival garden, right? But when it comes harvest time, we're worried about what we're going to do with all the extra food because we can only freeze so much. Even though we bought one of those extra long freezers, we only have so much storage space. And the good stuff about this is as long as it's sealed properly, it can last 25 years, right?
Yeah, so everything that you just like you said, when you put it in a freezer, of course that's a good way to store things, especially for, somewhat short term. As long as it's properly stored, you can kind of avoid freezer burn for at least a little while. But even, after a year or two, the best stored stuff in a freezer is going to eventually lose some of that value. And on top of that, you run the risk of, if you have a power outage or something like that, then, you could easily lose some of that food as well. But if you freeze dry that same food, then you can have all that food with all the nutrition you would have had from freezing it, so that all stays intact. But you can properly seal it in a package, in a Mylar bag, or in, different ways people do it, but like a number 10 can, or even mason jars, and then you can have that shelf life of 10 to 25 years. So it's a little bit shorter if you put it into mason jars. It's a little bit longer in certain types of Mylar bags, and some foods like meats are meant to be about 15 years, but easily fruits and vegetables from your garden, like you said, 25 years, no problem if it's properly stored. And that makes a big difference to people too, because, like you said, if you have a garden and you're at all trying to grow some of the food, you know how much goes to waste or that you feel like you have to give away just because it all starts to kind of come on at the same time. I mean, I can't think of how many times when I've had zucchini or tomatoes and they're just all coming on, full speed at the same time, and you just end up having to either waste them or give them away. But if you're able to freeze dry them, then you know what, come this winter when there's not any produce, or come 5 years from now when you pull it out to use it, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, it's still just as good as the day that you put it in your freeze dryer.
Yeah. Well, some of the other methods like dehydrating and canning, you lose a lot of the vitamins and nutrition, don't you? But with your guys' process, you weave a lot of that in, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So just like I was saying, if people are used to using their freezers to store food and know that the nutrition content of their food in the freezer basically stays the same. If I put corn in my freezer, I expect when I pull it out, it's still going to be the same nutritional value as it was before I put it in the freezer. But if you can or you dehydrate, you easily lose up to 50% of the nutritional value. And it's not because you did anything to purposely get rid of that, but the heat process that is used during the canning process and during the dehydrating process is what's ruining that nutritional content. So when you put it in a canning jar or when you dehydrate, then you just know that heat process is going to destroy some of that nutrition. When you freeze dry it, what's actually happening is it's very similar to freezing it. You're putting it in a freezer. It's getting much, much, much colder than your regular freezer. In your freeze dryer, it takes that food down to about negative 50 degrees. When it gets that cold, then this vacuum pump turns on, and what happens is inside the chamber where the food is, these tiny, tiny, slight little heaters that are just so slight barely start to warm the food just in the slightest amount. And what happens is in that vacuum environment, that water starts to evaporate off, but it can't exist as water at that point. It turns into a gas. So the water turns into a gas and starts to freeze around the outside of the chamber, similar to how when you have a freezer that needs to be defrosted and you see ice around the edges. That's kind of what happens inside this chamber. This water freezes around the outside of the chamber, and it keeps doing that over and over and over again, just by slight amounts. So what ends up happening is all the food comes out of your water, but it leaves the pores of your food the same because it's literally evaporated out as a gas. So everywhere where the water once was is still intact. So when you go later to use that food, those pores are still there and can absorb the water right back into the food. And that's different than when you canned or you dehydrated that food, those pores don't exist anymore. You couldn't rehydrate a banana chip or rehydrate an apple, a dehydrated apple, because the pores are no longer there. So at that point, there's nothing that it can be other than, heated up or added to something to make it good or just eaten as a snack. But if you have something that's freeze-dried, like a freeze-dried apple, those pores are still there. So when you add the water back and let that apple sit in a little bowl of water or sit somewhere, it starts to pull that water back in to where it was before, and it can't absorb more water than it once had. It just absorbs the right amount back in, and then you have your apple right back to how it was before it was freeze-dried.
Yeah. Wow. Now, a lot of people have a problem getting their kids to eat more fruits and stuff, and all they want to eat is candy. But when you do fruits with this, it tastes almost like candy, doesn't it?
Yeah, you know what? We've had
kids
people
love this
come
stuff.
To our warehouse where we make all these, and kids love it. Like, I'm really not exaggerating this. Like, freeze-dried apples and freeze-dried bananas and freeze-dried grapes taste like things they're used to eating that are way more treat-like. So, if you're having apples or pears or things like that, they crunch in their mouth like potato chips would. If you're having grapes, they crunch in their mouth like Skittles kind of would. And so they taste to little kids a lot more appealing because they have that little bit of crunch. If you're eating them as a snack, they have that little bit of crunch. But then as a mom or as a dad or something, that you could potentially take, that fruit or those vegetables and put it right back into a soup or something that would come back the way that it originally existed. And the other thing that people have told us a lot that they try to do is they'll take, let's say you freeze-dry zucchini, and you take your zucchini, you put it in, maybe some sort of food processor where you turn it into a powder, and then you can literally take your freeze-dried food and turn it into a powder and add that to things like spaghetti sauce or, mac and cheese. And they don't even know that what you've done is added back in zucchini or tomatoes or, healthy vegetables, because they can't tell. It doesn't change. That powder added doesn't change the texture of what they're used to eating. So now you have this healthy ingredients basically infused back into regular food. And people have told us that lots of times their kids don't even realize that that's how they, put their veggies back into their diet.
Nice. Now, you were telling me some of this technology started, was it from the space program, or was it with the vaccines during World War I or II?
Yeah, so the way that freeze-drying really came about, I think there's some research that shows they were really working on it before World War II, but what really happened during the World War II period is the military was trying to figure out how do we get serums, how do we get vaccines to the troops overseas in these war areas, in these war zones, before it spoils, before it gets ruined. Some of those things, have a shelf life, and they needed to get there before they could be ruined. And so freeze-drying first came about to be able to help get these vaccines, these serums to the troops overseas. Scientists had been working on it, and they realized, and that technology is still used today. Many of our pharmaceutical things, many of our serums and vaccines are still freeze-dried because it preserves them in the exact state that they need to be until they're ready to be used. So that was where it first started. But as throughout World War II, then it was like, we can try this with food. So they started doing it with food as well to be able to get food in some of these places. But then after World War II, then NASA really started to adopt this as well because they saw the greatness of using this type of food for people in space because, one, it didn't really weigh anything, and two, it could have the nutritional content still intact. And so it was very easy to be able to, provide astronauts with the proper nutrition in their food and yet not have to worry that they were packing, all these cans of food and other things like that taken into space that could also cause problems. And so that was really the NASA program was really who continued to develop it. And lots of people have sometimes heard of freeze-dried food in several years. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C. or places like that, then lots of people have seen, the astronaut ice cream and things like that.